Hi, friends. Welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager at the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for the second day of our read along together of A Room with a View by E.M. Forster. Let's see. I thought we would start out with a very special tea today. Um, it is for anyone who's watching this after the fact and maybe didn't look at the date that it first appeared. This is airing on November the 3rd, which, as we know, is election day here in the United States. And so, in honor of the excitingness that is election day, I decided to make a special red, white, and blue tea. How would I do this? Well, I got by combining a red rooibos tea bag, a black tea that is blueberry flavored, and a white tea, which I added on a few extra colors because the only white tea I had on hand was the white, orange, peach, and ginger tea. So we're getting a red, white, and blue tea with a little bit of orange, peach, and ginger colors also. So let's go ahead and give this a try. I am actually very curious as to whether this will be good. I hope it'll be good. One always hopes for good things, but as they say, democracy is a messy process. It is not an easy form of government. If it was, well, where did I hear that quote recently? Something about the easiest form of government is, where you're told exactly what to do, but democracy is messy and you never know exactly what's going to happen, and that's what makes it beautiful. So let's hope for this tea. Mm. It has a really interesting smell to it. I can smell the blueberry. Hello, how are you guys doing? Ooh, that's actually really good. Yeah, the blueberry's nice in there. The rooibos, you can kind of taste it. The white tea, I'm not exactly sure if that's getting overpowered by the other one, but it's still very good. I was worried that the flavors would fight with each other too much, but it's actually very good. So, yay, let's hear it for democracy and red, white, and blue tea. And if you haven't already gone out, by the way, and voted, please go ahead and vote. All of our San Diego public libraries are serving as mail ballot drop off locations all the way till 8 p.m. I'll be here at the PV Library till 8 p.m. tonight, along with the workers from the Registrar of Voters, so that your vote can be received. And so, thank you very much for everyone who has already gone out and voted. And again, if you have not yet, please go and do so. The polls are open tonight till 8 o'clock. So now that we've had our red, white, and blue tea, let's talk a little bit about what we read yesterday. And let's see. So we started A Room with a View. And as you may have noticed, our chapters are a lot shorter in this book than the other. I did a little, it's so funny. I try to be organized here. I made a little chart for myself of about exactly how many pages are in each chapter and about what day I think we're going to read it. And according to my schedule right now, I think we're going to finish on Tuesday, December 1st. But I'm thinking maybe we can squeeze a few more in and like combine a few days with a few extra chapters so that we can finish right before Thanksgiving. Because I think that might be kind of fun also. So we'll see how the length of these readings feel to us. If they're feeling too short, then I might combine a few other ones so we can finish right before the end of before Thanksgiving break. But we'll see what happens. Let's start out with chapter 1 discussion. So in the Bertolini, it started out basically with two characters talking with each other, maybe arguing a little bit. Ooh, sorry, I just saw that somebody's having coffee and milk with leftover Halloween candies. I love Halloween candies. That sounds so good. um, good tea choice, Pam. Very good. Let's see. By tea, I mean tea time. Tea time can include coffee, of course. Let's see. So it started in the Bertolini, which is, and again, I've already told you guys I will probably mispronounce many things, and I think one of them is I thought that when I had seen the film, which again is near and dear to me, but it's been many years, I thought they called it the Pensione Bertolini. So when they are just referring to it as by not saying the whole name, should it be the Pensione, even though it's spelled like pension? Pension? I don't even know. We'll see how it works out today. I think I was calling it the pension yesterday, but it felt so much like a retirement fund. I might go for pension, and I don't know if that's correct, but we'll go for it. But either way, it starts out at the Bertolini. And basically, Charlotte Bartlett is the older cousin and chaperone for Lucy Honeychurch. And the two of them are two English ladies who have just arrived in Florence in Italy. And they're talking about their disappointment that their rooms do not have a view. They were promised rooms with a view, and in fact, they're looking out over a courtyard, so they're both a little griping about that. They're also picking on the dinner that Charlotte is saying the meat doesn't look very good. And then also, Lucy is saying she's even more disappointed too that it just, even though they've gone all the way to Italy, that it feels like they're just in England, because they look around the dining room table and the proprietress is an English lady, that the other guests are all English. The picture on the wall is Queen Victoria, and so it's like, it just, even though they've gone across, across the pond and gone to Italy, it feels like they're just in England, and just like, ugh, and not even a view. It's like the last straw, and just they're both a little unhappy and cranky. And as they're arguing with each other gently, politely, genteelly, let's say, we'll get to use that word genteel a lot, I think, in this book. Um, One of the gentlemen who's at the table, Mr. Emerson, says, I've got a room with a view. My son has a room with a view. We don't value the view. Why don't we just trade rooms? I mean, clearly, I think you'd enjoy it. And although this is an incredibly kind and generous offer, it is not a polite offer. He should, according to the rules of society, he should not have acknowledged that he had overheard the two women griping with each other. He should also not be, as a man and his son also, each occupying these rooms, is it appropriate that they should be almost sharing a bedroom in that way, of like exchanging bedrooms? Is it too intimate? And so, it's a very restrictive society. And so the fact that he would just sort of speak up and say, common sense says that you want the rooms that we don't value, why don't we trade, is not common sense of the time. And so it's like a social faux pas. And so Miss Bartlett is like, absolutely, we cannot have any obligation to men. They might want something from us in return later on. And so it's an interesting little glimpse into the kind of ideas that are binding them, even when they're out there and this generous offer comes to them. And so they continue the conversation later on after dinner, and there's a gentleman who comes, who's the Reverend Mr. Beebe. And Mr. Beebe is somebody who Lucy Honeychurch had briefly met before. And Mr. Beebe, it turns out, is about to become the priest in the area where she lives, where her home of Windy Corner, I think it was called. And so Mr. Beebe intervenes, and he says, that man, Mr. Emerson, it was rather impolite of him to make that offer, but I actually don't think he's trying to ask you for anything and put you into any kind of debt or obligation. He's kind of a free thinker. He's a socialist. Oh my goodness. But he has a good heart. And I think he was just trying to offer you something that he thought would make you happy, that he genuinely does not value it for himself. And so, on Mr. Beebe's recommendation, they sort of come around to the thing of like, well, maybe we can do this. Now, what's also very interesting too is that there's a woman who we don't know her name yet in this chapter, but she's one of the two elderly sisters that was in the drawing room also, or sorry, the dinner room. And so she had overheard the conversations, and she says this thing that she says about old Mr. Emerson. No, he is not tactful, yet have you ever noticed that there are people who do things which are most indelicate and yet at the same time beautiful? And I think that's something that we want to keep in mind with this story, is that Mr. Emerson, Miss Bartlett is, she epitomizes like this idea of the rules of society, and Mr. Emerson is this idea of the rules are not necessarily there to be followed. You do what your heart says, and it's that sense that he's following his heart and he's doing what is beautiful. And so it's an interesting idea that Charlotte is having a hard time fathoming, because in Miss Bartlett's world, to not follow the rules is just wrong. And so how could it be something beautiful? Again, as we spoke about, this is an interesting time where things were just, societal mores were opening up and changing, and it's we get to see it here in this story, in just this little vignette about the room and the view. So basically, Mr. Beebe, he goes out to the smoking room with the gentleman, and he comes back and he says, Mr. Emerson said again that he'd be happy to do it, and so let's, if you're okay with it, let's make the trade. And Miss Bartlett is like, well, it seems now like you're kind of judging me, that you're thinking that I shouldn't have refused him the first time, so very well, I'll make the sacrifice. It will be on my head that we make this trade. So Charlotte is again establishing herself as the martyr, and being a little bit officious about everything, but it's who she is. And so they agree that they will change the rooms. And so and Charlotte again, and Lucy's like, well, let me help pack up. And Charlotte's like, no, I will do it. I'll do everything. So again, Charlotte is the martyr. Um, and again, she does have the role of the chaperone. She is a poor cousin. She is being paid by the Honeychurch family to, like they've paid for some of her tickets and things like that. So she may have that obligation there also, but it's also part of it, her nature. And so, yeah, it's great. So they end up trading the rooms, and Charlotte makes a point of saying how she has kept the larger of the two rooms, which normally her place would not be to keep the larger of the two rooms, but she's doing it because she knows that the young man, George Emerson, the son, had inhabited that room. And in fact, when she goes there, she sees a very odd thing. She sees a paper over the washstand, so like over the mirror where, after he like shaved or whatever, where she sees a large question mark. Nothing else, just a large question mark. That would be the thing he would want to look at each day. And she questions what it means, and she examines it. At first, it looks menacing or obnoxious, perhaps even pretentious of evil, and she wants to destroy it. But then she can't because she realizes it doesn't belong to her. It's Mr. Emerson's, and so she sets it aside for him. But again, it's that idea of the things that we don't understand must be evil, and the things that we don't understand must be scary and somehow threatening to her, and that she has to stop it. So this is the setting we have for chapter 1. Chapter 2 is entitled In Santa Croce with no Baedeker. Again, for anyone who isn't familiar, a Baedeker is a series. Baedeker was a publisher of travel guides. So for in the modern era, it'd be like saying visiting San Diego with no Fodors or Fromers or Lonely Planet guide. So chapter 2 is entitled In Santa Croce with no Baedeker. It was pleasant to wake up in Florence, to open the eyes upon a bright bare room, with a floor of red tiles which look clean, though they are not, with a painted ceiling whereon pink griffins and blue amorini sport in a forest of yellow violins and bassoons. It was pleasant, too, to fling wide the windows, pinching the fingers in unfamiliar fastenings, to lean out into sunshine with beautiful hills and trees and marble churches opposite, and close below the Arno, gurgling against the embankment of the road. Over the river, men were at work with spades and sieves on the sandy foreshore, and on the river was a boat, also diligently employed for some mysterious end. An electric tram came rushing underneath the window. No one was inside it, except one tourist, but its platforms were overflowing with Italians who preferred to stand. Children tried to hang on behind, and the conductor, with no malice, spat in their faces to make them let go. Then soldiers appeared, good-looking, undersized men, wearing each a knapsack covered with mangy fur and a greatcoat which had been cut for some larger soldier. Beside them walked officers looking foolish and fierce, and before them went little boys turning somersaults in time with the band. The tram car became entangled in their ranks and moved on painfully, like a caterpillar in a swarm of ants. One of the little boys fell down, and some white bullocks came out of an archway. Indeed, if it had not been for the good advice of an old man who was selling button-hooks, the road might never have got clear. Over such trivialities as these many a valuable hour may slip away, and the traveler who has gone to Italy to study the tactile values of Giotto or the corruption of the papacy may return remembering nothing but the blue sky and the men and the women who live under it. So it was as well that Miss Bartlett should tap and come in, and having commented on Lucy's leaving the door unlocked, and on her leaning out of the window before she was fully dressed, should urge her to hasten herself, or the best of the day would be gone. By the time Lucy was ready, her cousin had done her breakfast and was listening to the clever lady among the crumbs. A conversation then ensued on not unfamiliar lines. Miss Bartlett was, after all, a wee bit tired, and thought they had better spend the morning settling in. Unless Lucy would at all like to go out? Lucy would rather like to go out, as it was her first day in Florence. But, of course, she could go alone. Miss Bartlett could not allow this. Of course she would accompany Lucy everywhere. Oh, certainly not. Lucy would stop with her cousin. Oh, no, that would never do. Oh, yes. At this point, the clever lady broke in. If it is Mrs. Grundy who is troubling you, I do assure you that you can neglect the good person. Being English, Miss Honeychurch will be perfectly safe. Italians understand. A dear friend of mine, Contessa Baroncelli, has two daughters, and when she cannot send a maid to school with them, she lets them go in sailor hats instead. Everyone takes them for English, you see, especially if their hair is strained tightly behind. Miss Bartlett was unconcerned by the safety of Contessa Baroncelli's daughters. She was determined to take Lucy herself, her head not being so very bad. The clever lady then said that she was going to spend a long morning in Santa Croce, and if Lucy would come too, she would be delighted. I will take you by a dear dirty back way, Miss Honeychurch, and if you bring me luck, we shall have an adventure. Lucy said that this was most kind, and at once opened the Baedeker to see where Santa Croce was. Tut, tut, Miss Lucy, I hope we shall soon emancipate you from Baedeker. He does but touch the surface of things. As to the true Italy, he does not even dream of it. The true Italy is only to be found by patient observation. This sounded very interesting, and Lucy hurried over her breakfast and started with her new friend in high spirits. Italy was coming at last. The Cockney Signora and her works had vanished like a bad dream. Miss Lavish, for that was the clever lady's name, turned to the right along the sunny Longarno. How delightfully warm! But a wind down the side streets cut like a knife, didn't it? Ponte alle Grazie, particularly interesting, mentioned by Dante. San Miniato, beautiful as well as interesting, the crucifix that kissed a murderer. Miss Honeychurch would remember the story. The men on the river were fishing. Untrue, but then, so is most information. Then Miss Lavish darted under the archway of the white bullocks, and she stopped and she cried, a smell! A true Florentine smell! Every city, let me teach you, has its own smell. Is it a very nice smell? Said Lucy, who had inherited from her mother a distaste to dirt. One doesn't come to Italy for niceness, was the retort. One comes for life. Buongiorno, buongiorno, bowing right and left. Look at that adorable wine cart, how the driver stares at us, dear simple soul. So Miss Lavish proceeded through the streets of the city of Florence, short, fidgety, and playful as a kitten, though without a kitten's grace. It was a treat for the girl to be with anyone so clever and so cheerful, and a blue military cloak, such as an Italian officer wears, only increased the sense of festivity. Buongiorno! Take the word of an old woman, Miss Lucy. You will never repent of a little civility to your inferiors. That is the true democracy, though I am a real radical as well. There, now you're shocked. Indeed, I'm not, exclaimed Lucy. We are radicals too, out and out. My father always voted for Mr. Gladstone until he was so dreadful about Ireland. I see, I see. And now you have gone over to the enemy. Oh, please. If my father was alive, I am sure he would vote radical again, now that Ireland is all right. And as it is, the glass over our front door was broken last election, and Freddie is sure it was the Tories. But mother says nonsense. A tramp. Shameful. A manufacturing district, I suppose? No, in the Surrey Hills, about 5 miles from Dorking, looking over the Weald. Miss Lavish seemed interested and slackened her trot. What a delightful part! I know it so well. It is full of the very nicest people. Do you know Sir Henry Otway? A radical, if ever there was one, if ever there was. Very well indeed. And old Mrs. Butterworth, the philanthropist? Why, she rents a field of us. How funny! Miss Lavish looked at the narrow ribbon of sky and murmured, Oh, you have property in Surrey. Hardly any, said Lucy, fearful of being thought a snob. Only 30 acres. Just the garden, all downhill, and some fields. Miss Lavish was not disgusted, and said it was just the size of her aunt's Suffolk estate. Italy receded. They tried to remember the last name of Lady Louisa someone, who had taken a house near Summer Street the other year, but she had not liked it, which was odd of her. And just as Miss Lavish had got the name, she broke off and exclaimed, "Bless us! Bless us and save us! We've lost the way." Certainly they had seemed a long time in reaching Santa Croce, the tower of which had been plainly visible from the landing window. But Miss Lavish had said so much about knowing her Florence by heart that Lucy had followed her with no misgivings. Lost! Lost, my dear Miss Lucy. During our political diatribes, we have taken a wrong turning. How those horrid conservatives would jeer at us. What are we to do? Two lone females in an unknown town. Now, this is what I call an adventure. Lucy, who wanted to see Santa Croce, suggested as a possible solution that they should ask the way there. "Oh, but that is the word of a craven. And no, you are not to look at your Baedeker. Give it to me. I shan't let you carry it. We will simply drift." Accordingly, they drifted through a series of those gray-brown streets, neither commodious nor picturesque, in which the eastern quarter of the city abounds. Lucy soon lost interest in the discontent of Lady Louisa, and became discontented herself. For one ravishing moment Italy appeared. She stood in the square of the Annunziata, and saw in the living terracotta those divine babies whom no cheap reproductions can ever stale. There they stood, with their shining limbs bursting from the garments of charity, and their strong white arms extended against circlets of heaven. Lucy thought she had never seen anything more beautiful, but Miss Lavish, with a shriek of dismay, dragged her forward, declaring that they were out of their path now by at least a mile. The hour was approaching at which the continental breakfast begins, or rather ceases, to tell, and the ladies bought some hot chestnut paste out of a little shop, because it looked so typical. It tasted partly of the paper in which it was wrapped, partly of hair oil, partly of partly of the great unknown. But it gave them strength to drift into another piazza, large and dusty, on the farther side of which rose a black and white facade of surpassing ugliness. Miss Lavish spoke to it dramatically. It was Santa Croce. The adventure was over. "Stop a minute. Let those two people go on, or I shall have to speak to them. I do detest conventional intercourse. Nasty. They are going to the church, too. Oh, the Britisher abroad." "We sat opposite them at dinner last night. They have given us their rooms. They were so very kind." "Look at their figures," laughed Miss Lavish. "They walk through my Italy like a pair of cows. It's very naughty of me, but I would like to set an examination paper at Dover, and turn back every tourist who couldn't pass it." "What would you ask us?" Miss Lavish laid her hand pleasantly on Lucy's arm, as if to suggest that she, at all events, would get full marks. In this exalted mood they reached the steps of the great church, and were about to enter it, when Miss Lavish stopped, squeaked, flung up her arms, and cried, "There goes my local color box. I must have a word with him." And in a moment she was away over the piazza, her military cloak flapping in the wind, nor did she slacken speed till she caught up to an old man with white whiskers, and nipped him playfully upon the arm. Lucy waited for nearly 10 minutes. Then she began to get tired. The beggars worried her, the dust blew in her eyes, and she remembered that a young girl ought not to loiter in public places. She descended slowly into the piazza with the intention of rejoining Miss Lavish, who was really almost too original. But at that moment Miss Lavish and her local color box moved also, and disappeared down a side street, both gesticulating largely. Tears of indignation came into Lucy's eyes, partly because Miss Lavish had jilted her, partly because she had taken her Baedeker. How could she find her way home? How could she find her way about in Santa Croce? Her first morning was ruined, and she might never be in Florence again. A few minutes ago she had been all high spirits, talking as a woman of culture and half persuading herself that she was full of originality. Now she entered the church, depressed and humiliated, not even able to remember whether it was built by the Franciscans or the Dominicans. Hmm. Of course, it must be a wonderful building, but how like a barn, and how very cold! Of course, it contained frescoes by Giotto, in the presence of whose tactile values she was capable of feeling what was proper. But who was to tell her which they were? She walked about disdainfully, unwilling to be enthusiastic over monuments of uncertain authorship or date. There was no one even to tell her which, of all the sepulchral slabs that paved the nave and transepts, was the one that was really beautiful, the one that had been most praised by Mr. Ruskin. Then the pernicious charm of Italy worked on her, and instead of acquiring information, she began to be happy. She puzzled out the notices that forbade people to introduce dogs into the church, the notice that prayed people, in the interest of health and out of respect to the sacred edifice in which they found themselves, not to spit. She watched the tourists. Their noses were as red as their Baedekers, so cold was Santa Croce. She beheld the horrible fate that overtook 3 papists, 2 he-babies and a she-baby, who began their career by sousing each other with the holy water, and then proceeded to the Machiavelli memorial, dripping but hallowed. Advancing toward it very slowly and from immense distances, they touched the stone with their fingers, with their handkerchiefs, with their heads, and then retreated. What could this mean? They did it again and again. Then Lucy realized that they had mistaken Machiavelli for some saint, hoping to acquire virtue. Punishment followed quickly. The smallest he-baby stumbled over one of the sepulchral slabs so much admired by Mr. Ruskin, and entangled his feet in the features of a recumbent bishop. Protestant as she was, Lucy darted forward. She was too late. He fell heavily upon the prelate's upturned toes. "Hateful bishop!" exclaimed the voice of old Mr. Emerson, who had darted forward also. "Hard in life, hard in death. Go out into the sunshine, little boy, and kiss your hand to the sun, for that is where you ought to be. Intolerable bishop!" The child screamed frantically at these words, and at these dreadful people who picked him up, dusted him, rubbed his bruises, and told him not to be superstitious. "Look at him," said Mr. Emerson to Lucy. "Here's a mess. A baby hurt, cold, and frightened. But what else can you expect from a church?" The child's legs had become as melting wax. Each time the old Mr. Emerson and Lucy set it erect, it collapsed with a roar. Fortunately, an Italian lady, who ought to have been saying her prayers, came to the rescue. By some mysterious virtue which mothers alone possess, she stiffened the little boy's backbone and imparted strength to his knees. He stood. Still gibbering with agitation, he walked away. "You are a clever woman," said Mr. Emerson. "You have done more than all the relics in the world. I am not of your creed, but I do believe in those who make their fellow creatures happy. There is no scheme of the universe—" He paused for a phrase. "Niente," said the Italian lady, and returned to her prayers. "I'm not sure she understands English," suggested Lucy. In her chastened mood she no longer despised the Emersons. She was determined to be gracious to them, beautiful rather than delicate, and if possible to erase Miss Bartlett's civility by some gracious reference to the pleasant rooms. "That woman understands everything," was Mr. Emerson's reply. "But what are you doing here? Are you doing the church? Are you through with the church?" "No," cried Lucy, remembering her grievance. "I came with Miss Lavish, who was to explain everything, and just by the door—it is too bad. She simply ran away, and after waiting quite a time I had to come in by myself." "Why shouldn't you?" said Mr. Emerson. "Yes, why shouldn't you come by yourself?" said the son, addressing the young lady for the first time. "But Miss Lavish has even taken away Baedeker." "Baedeker?" said Mr. Emerson. "I'm glad it's that you minded. It's worth minding the loss of a Baedeker." That's worth minding." Lucy was puzzled. She was again conscious of some new idea and was not sure whither it would lead her. "If you've no Baedeker," said the son, "you'd better join us." Was this where the idea would lead? She took refuge in her dignity. "Thank you very much, but I could not think of that. I hope you do not suppose that I came here to join on to you. You really came to help with the child. I really came to help with the child, and to thank you for so kindly giving us your rooms last night. I hope that you have not been put to any great inconvenience." "My dear," said the old man gently, "I think that you are repeating what you have heard older people say. You are pretending to be touchy, but you are not really. Stop being so tiresome, and tell me instead what part of the church you want to see. To take you to it will be a real pleasure." Now, this was abominably impertinent, and she ought to have been furious. But it is sometimes as difficult to lose one's temper as it is difficult at other times to keep it. Lucy could not get cross. Mr. Emerson was an old man, and surely a girl might humor him. On the other hand, his son was a young man, and she felt that a girl ought to be offended with him, or at all events be offended before him. It was at him that she gazed before replying. "I am not touchy, I hope. It is the Giottos that I want to see, if you will kindly tell me which they are." The son nodded. With a look of sombre satisfaction he led the way to the Peruzzi chapel. There was a hint of the teacher about him. She felt like a child in school who had answered a question rightly. The chapel was already filled with an earnest congregation, and out of them rose the voice of a lecturer, directing them how to worship Giotto, not by tactful valuations, but by the standards of the spirit. "Remember," he was saying, "the facts about this church of Santa Croce, how it was built by faith in the full fervor of medievalism, before any taint of the Renaissance had appeared. Observe how Giotto in these frescoes, now unhappily ruined by restoration, is untroubled by the snares of anatomy and perspective. Could anything be more majestic, more pathetic, beautiful, true? How little, we feel, avails knowledge and technical cleverness against a man who truly feels." "No!" exclaimed Mr. Emerson, in much too loud a voice for church. "Remember nothing of the sort. Built by faith, indeed. That simply means the working men weren't paid properly. And as for the frescoes, I see no truth in them. Look at that fat man in blue. He must weigh as much as I do, and he is shooting into the sky like an air balloon." He was referring to the Ascension of St. John. Inside, the lecturer's voice faltered, as well it might. The audience shifted uneasily, and so did Lucy. She was sure that she ought not to be with these men, but they had cast a spell over her. They were so serious and so strange that she could not remember how to behave. "Now, did this happen, or didn't it? Yes or no?" George replied. "It happened like this, if it happened at all. I would rather go up to heaven by myself than be pushed by cherubs, and if I got there I should like my friends to lean out of it, just as they do here." "You will never go up," said his father. "You and I, dear boy, will lie at peace in the earth that bore us, and our names will disappear as surely as our work survives." Some of the people can only see the empty grave, not the saint, whoever he is, going up. It did happen like that, if it happened at all. "Pardon me," said a frigid voice. "The chapel is somewhat small for two parties. We will incommode you no longer." The lecturer was a clergyman, and his audience must be also his flock, for they held prayer books as well as guide books in their hands. They filed out of the chapel in silence. Amongst them were the two little old ladies of the Pension Bertolini, Miss Teresa and Miss Catherine Allen. "Stop!" cried Mr. Emerson. "There's plenty of room for us all. Stop!" The procession disappeared without a word. Soon the lecturer could be heard in the next chapel, describing the life of St. Francis. George, I do believe that clergyman is the Brixton curate. George went into the next chapel and returned, saying, Perhaps he is, I don't remember. Then I had better speak to him and remind him who I am. It's that Mr. Eager. Why did he go? Did we talk too loud? How vexatious. I shall go and say we are sorry. Hadn't I better? Then perhaps he will come back. He will not come back, said George. But Mr. Emerson, contrite and unhappy, hurried away to apologize to the Reverend Cuthbert Eager. Lucy, apparently absorbed in a lunette, could hear the lecture again interrupted, the anxious, aggressive voice of the old man, the curt, injured replies of his opponent. The son, who took every little contretemps as if it were a tragedy, was listening also. My father has that effect on nearly everyone, he informed her. He will try to be kind. I hope we all try, said she, smiling nervously, because we think it improves our characters. But he is kind to people because he loves them, and they find him out and are offended or frightened. How silly of them, said Lucy, though in her heart she sympathized. I think that a kind action, done tactfully, tact? He threw up his head in disdain. Apparently she had given the wrong answer. She watched the singular creature pace up and down the chapel. For a young man his face was rugged, and until the shadows fell on it, excuse me. For a young man his face was rugged, and until the shadows fell upon it, hard. Enshadowed, it sprang into tenderness. She saw him once again at Rome on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, carrying a burden of acorns. Healthy and muscular, he yet gave her a feeling of grayness, of tragedy that might only find solution in the night. The feeling soon passed. It was unlike her to have entertained anything so subtle. Born of silence and of unknown emotion, it passed when Mr. Emerson returned, and she could re-enter the world of rapid talk, which was alone familiar to her. Were you snubbed? Asked his son tranquilly. But we have spoilt the pleasure of I don't know how many people. They won't come back. Full of innate sympathy, quickness to perceive good in others, vision of the brotherhood of man. Scraps of the lecture on St. Francis came floating round the partition wall. Don't let us spoil yours, he continued to Lucy. Have you looked at those saints? Yes, said Lucy. They are lovely. Do you know which is the tombstone that is praised in Ruskin? He did not know, and suggested that they should try to guess it. George, rather to her relief, refused to move, and she and the old man wandered not unpleasantly about Santa Croce, which, though it is like a barn, has harvested many beautiful things inside its walls. There were also beggars to avoid, and guides to dodge round the pillars, and an old lady with her dog, and here and there a priest modestly edging to his mass through the groups of tourists. But Mr. Emerson was only half interested. He watched the lecturer, whose success he believed he had impaired, and then he anxiously watched his son. Why will he look at that fresco? He said uneasily. I saw nothing in it. I like Giotto, she replied. It is so wonderful what they say about his tactile values, though I like things like the Della Robbia babies better. So you ought. A baby is worth a dozen saints, and my baby's worth the whole of paradise, and as far as I can see, he lives in hell. Lucy again felt that this did not do. In hell, he repeated. He's unhappy. Oh dear, said Lucy. How can he be unhappy when he is strong and alive? What more is one to give him? And think how he has been brought up, free from the superstition and ignorance that lead men to hate one another in the name of God. With such an education as that, I thought he was bound to grow up happy. She was no theologian, but she felt that here was a very foolish old man, as well as a very irreligious one. She also felt that her mother might not like her talking to that kind of person, and that Charlotte would object most strongly. What are we to do with him? He asked. He comes out for his holiday to Italy and behaves like that. like the little child who ought to have been playing and who hurt himself upon the tombstone. Eh? What did you say? Lucy had made no suggestion. Suddenly he said, "Now, don't be stupid over this. I don't require you to fall in love with my boy, but I do think you might try and understand him. You are nearer his age, and if you let yourself go, I am sure you are sensible. You might help me. He has known so few women, and you have the time. You stopped here several weeks, I suppose? But let yourself go. You are inclined to get muddled, if I may judge from last night. Let yourself go. Pull out from the depths those thoughts that you do not understand and spread them out in the sunlight and know the meaning of them. By understanding George, you may learn to understand yourself. It will be good for both of you." To this extraordinary speech, Lucy found no answer. "I only know what it is that's wrong with him, not why it is." "And what is it?" asked Lucy fearfully, expecting some harrowing tale. "The old trouble. Things won't fit." "What things?" "The things of the universe. It is quite true. They don't." "Oh, Mr. Emerson, whatever do you mean?" In his ordinary voice, so that she scarcely realized he was quoting poetry, he said, "From far, from eve and morning, and yon 12-winded sky, the stuff of life to knit me blew hither. Here am I." George and I both know this, but why does it distress him? We know that we come from the winds, and that we shall return to them, that all life is perhaps a knot, a tangle, a blemish in the eternal smoothness. But why should this make us unhappy? Let us rather love one another, and work and rejoice. I don't believe in this world's sorrow. Miss Honeychurch assented. "Then make my boy think like us. Make him realize that by the side of the everlasting why, there is a yes. A transitory yes if you like, but a yes." Suddenly she laughed. Surely one ought to laugh. A young man melancholy because the universe wouldn't fit? Because life was a tangle, or a wind, or a yes, or something? "I'm very sorry," she cried. "You'll think me unfeeling, but—" Then she became matronly. "Oh, but your son wants employment. Has he no particular hobby? Why, I myself have worries, but I can generally forget them at the piano, and collecting stamps did no end of good for my brother. Perhaps Italy bores him. You ought to try the Alps or the lakes." The old man's face saddened, and he touched her gently with his hand. This did not alarm her. She thought that her advice had impressed him, and that he was thanking her for it. Indeed, he no longer alarmed her at all. She regarded him as a kind thing, but quite silly. Her feelings were as inflated spiritually as they had been an hour ago aesthetically, before she lost Baedeker. The dear George, now striding towards them over the tombstones, seemed both pitiable and absurd. He approached, his face in the shadow. He said, "Miss Bartlett." "Oh, good gracious me," said Lucy, suddenly collapsing and again seeing the whole of life in a new perspective. "Where? Where?" "In the nave." "I see. Those gossiping little Miss Allens must have—" She checked herself. "Poor girl!" exploded Mr. Emerson. "Poor girl!" She could not let this pass, for it was just what she was feeling herself. "Poor girl? I fail to understand the point of that remark. I think myself a very fortunate girl, I assure you. I'm thoroughly happy and having a splendid time. Pray don't waste time mourning over me. There's enough sorrow in the world, isn't there, without trying to invent it? Good-bye. Thank you both so much for your kindness. Ah, yes, there does come my cousin. A delightful morning. Santa Croce is a wonderful church." She joined her cousin. That concludes Chapter 2 of A Room with a View by E.M. Forster. Thank you again for joining me for our read-along together. I'm going to go ahead and finish off my mug of red, white, and blue tea in honor of Election Day. I hope you're having a great rest of your day, and I will see you again tomorrow. Take care, my friends. Arrivederci.